Hi, everyone. Welcome to Fireside Adoptees Constellation and Legislation Space. And we're happy to bring you another great conversation today with David Bohl, who I'd like to read to you a little about. He's certainly a name that's well known in our community far and wide. And David is an MA. He's a clinical substance abuse counselor and a master addiction counselor. David is a relinquishee and adoptee, a professional independent addiction and recovery consultant at Beacon Confidential LLC, and a former consumer of substance use disorder and mental health services. He's also a writer, speaker, and the author of two works, Parallel Universes, The Story of Rebirth, which is a memoir that chronicles the intersection of adoption and addiction in his life, and another title, Relinquishment and Addiction, What Trauma Has to Do with It, which is a monograph that provides an overview of the complex issues involved in relinquishment and adoption, and in particular as they relate to the susceptibility of addiction. David works with individuals experiencing addictions and those where relinquishment, abandonment were experienced as a trauma and or where adoption was experienced as a developmental or chronic trauma of stress, as well as working with their families, genetic and adoptive. So welcome, David. Very, very honored to have you here today.
Thank you, Greg. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. You're somebody I've come to admire a great deal. I've had the great fortune of meeting you in person a few times over the last year and a half or so. And each time you've been so genteel and so supportive of what other members of the adoption space, the Constellation, are doing. You were supportive of me personally. You even asked, can I do to help out in Fireside? And we're honored to have you here to speak about an important topic. But I wonder if we could start a little bit with just some background on you as an adoptee, maybe just a few minutes about your adoptee story.
Absolutely. And I'll try to keep it a few minutes. And by the way, thank you very much for the suggestion about breathing. You're going to notice that when I get enthusiastic, I tend to speak very quickly. So that advice to take some breaths is very important for me. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Also, likewise, I feel similarly about you and the work that you and Amanda and others do here at Fireside. You're such an integral part of our community. Lots of people have found validation and connection here, and I'm really honored to be speaking with you all tonight as a result. My story gets longer all the time, the longer I live, of course, right? When I wrote my memoir 6 years ago, my story had, I thought, been completed at that time, but guess what? I found out what most of us knew or found out, and that was that the story keeps living. It keeps going on, and we have more things that we are challenged with and processed with. Yeah, I'm going to keep this really simple. I identify as any number of things. I would call myself a baby scoop era adoptee and relinquishee. I would describe myself as the brother of an adoptee. I would describe myself further as someone who's had a DNA surprise, and I have a grandparent, NPE. I'm someone who is in union with some genetic family members, and I'm someone who's active and in need of the support of this community that we're all building. And that takes any number of forms, but very quickly I was relinquished by a single woman who was in college here in my home state of Wisconsin. I learned later on, despite the fact that for decades I felt that she had likely made a very selfish decision, as had my father, I learned likely that it was more societal pressure and family religion that caused shame to the family and the decision to relinquish me. And by the way, I was able to make that turn when I read the book, The Girls Who Went Away, and was able to see and empathize with those who were in that position back in that period in which I was relinquished and adopted. I lived much of my life telling anyone who would listen that I didn't need to find out where I came from. I didn't need those people. Right? It was their mistake for relinquishing me. I'm just quite fine. Thank you very much. And I lived that way for a long time until I started having children of my own with my wife. And my wife very wisely kept reminding me, wisely and gently, saying, David, you know, I know this is about you, but it's about our kids too. They deserve to know what's going on. And I fought it for a really long time. There was a time where I couldn't not investigate it. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I'd had some grand mal seizures. I was seeing a neurologist. He suggested that I needed to find some family history. So I had to jump right in. And when I did, I found out a lot. Right? I found out what had happened before I was relinquished. I found out who my genetic father was, in addition to my mother. I found out I had predispositions for addiction and mental health in my family, and that I had all kinds of half siblings around the United States, some of whom were actually searching for me. and I have connected with them, and I have relationships with many of them as we speak. I have learned that my story preceded me. My biological mother died as a result of her alcoholism, and that informs not only my life's philosophy, but informs my passion for this topic in our community. So having said that, I'm deeply in union. I don't say reunion because my genetic parents had passed before I was able to search for them, but I am in union with some relatives, and it has provided me with some context and some information that has helped me to understand better who I am. And to me, that's a lifesaver. I have the luxury of that. DNA has helped with that, but the journey keeps giving, right? Learning about this new gentleman who's my grandfather has brought up the same old questions. How far do I go? What do I need to know? How do I do this without parachuting into people's lives and having expectations that are imparted upon them rather than having expectations of a two-sided relationship? Yet I feel very great about where I am today. I have been married to a wonderful woman. How she's put up with me for so long, I don't know. We just celebrated 40 years of marital bliss. I have 2 adult children who are actively in my lives. I practice some philosophies that help me to feel good about myself, but also the world. And that's not easy to do in this day and age. So that would be my basic adoptee story.
That's a wonderful summary, and it hits so many things here that I think resonate with a lot of us who are adoptees, who have entered that space of awareness and have started to search and found out things about ourselves and our families. And one of the things you mentioned here was finding out about genetic disposition. Maybe that can lead a little bit into the whole subject here of addiction recovery. So, and you and I have shared these questions back and forth. So we'll go over the things that came to mind for me. And maybe I can kind of combine these first two, which is, if you could talk a little bit about the forms that addiction may manifest. And then maybe there are some forms that we don't as widely recognize or acknowledge that may be present in the lives of adoptees.
Certainly. Well, certainly when we think about addiction, we default to thinking about a chemical. And we live in a day and age where sadly we are finding new ways to harm each other, right? The latest wave has been fentanyl, yet you will hear of other waves of chemicals and other compounds that are mood altering and reality altering for some people that are doing infinite damage to our human race. So when we're talking about addiction, it's important to remember we're talking about addiction through chemicals, but also addictive behaviors that may be unhealthy, behaviors that may be so repetitious that they cause additional harm. But I'm going to talk in a general way about all of them. And of course, the answer to your question ultimately is that the rates at which we relinquished and adopted individuals experience addiction challenges to chemicals, in other words, are very high. And are not really well known by much of the population. It's not known that we experience these things differently, although we would hope that if someone just understood us a little bit, they would understand why these lifetime chronic stresses might cause these reactions or these unhealthy coping mechanisms. That just hasn't been the case. Yet there is research on this. Research has consistently shown that adoptees are more likely, that is, that they're predisposed, the odds are higher to experience higher rates of mental health disorders, and that includes substance use disorders, than other non-adoptees. And adoptees also in longitudinal studies, there's a massive study done that included over 400 adoptees. They actually reported the prevalence of lifetime substance use disorders versus non-adoptees. And in this national study, adoptees were 43% more likely, or 1.87 times more likely to have a substance use disorder in their lifetime than non-adoptees. And equally, the numbers also showed that of the people surveyed, 50% of the adoptees had reported a substance use disorder at some time in their lives. And that's versus about 33% of the general population. So that's half of us, and that's huge. And it's something I'm glad that we're able to talk about here. And with regard to specific addictions, which I think was inherent in part of your question, they range, but they're not real drastic. I mean, they range from about 1.78 times higher in cannabis or marijuana dependence to 3.14 times more prevalent in amphetamine dependence. And of course, we could talk for a really long time about amphetamines and Adderall and our population having high diagnoses of ADHD and how that Adderall is used to medicate that, as are other amphetamines. But we ultimately have about 2 times the risk in the general than the general population has for addiction. And that's massive. And I don't know, there aren't a lot of medical professionals, let alone mental health professionals, who are aware of this. So What we also know is that we're also at greater risk to receive substance use and mental health services. The research shows that we use services at a rate higher than the general population. We have higher rates of personality disorders than the general population. And these are just long-lasting disruptive patterns of thinking and behavior over a lifetime. We are disproportionately represented in addiction treatment at a rate of 14 times non-adopted persons. Now, when I went back to grad school in my mid-40s, I had a caseload and I had 8 or 10 people on my caseload, and I noticed that I had several adoptees at any given time on my caseload, and I thought, oh, this is just an aberration, right? This is the universe's way of putting things in my lap that I should be working very hard to understand. And ultimately, that's held true over my lifetime, right? At any given time, at that time, my caseload was 30% adoptees. Now it's obviously more than 50% because that's the work that I do. But not only do we have different problems with substance abuses, but also we have problems with eating disorders and attention deficit disorder, as I mentioned, and suicide and untimely pregnancies. And although these are not addictions per se, they are certainly coping mechanisms that are unhealthy that can turn on us over a lifetime. Certainly when we think about things that we really need to focus on that are even less acknowledged or recognized than we ordinarily might say, it's one of the latter that I just mentioned. Adoptees who suffer from eating disorders are growing at alarming rates. And yet the general public and even mental health fields and medical fields aren't aware of this, because most of the information about this is anecdotal. It's not really been studied in a structured way. And that's really interesting, because I would guess that those of us here tonight would really understand or have no problem understanding that there are biological, environmental, and societal factors that being adopted cause stress that results in unhealthy eating, including eating excessive carbs or sugars or having a binge eating disorder, right? These are things that are prevalent in our community, yet they remain theoretical and unknown to the medical profession because they're under research. But again, it's not a stretch to observe this, and it's in simplest terms. We are a population that often feels incomplete or defective, and eating can be a way to fill those voids.
Certainly attest to that. That happens to be one I struggle with a lot. These big weight swings, and yeah, I was very interested to hear about all of the statistics. Certainly could sound very daunting, I'm sure, when you first learned about them, and still kind of collating and amassing them. That must have been like a particularly maybe overwhelming. How did you feel actually seeing that there were such a overrepresentation?
You can imagine there was some concern, right? I mean, it is daunting. It is daunting to see these statistics and to know that I've derived genetically from individuals who've experienced these things. At the same time, it's somewhat, I don't know if comforting is the right word, but having that awareness means that we've identified a problem that we can actually work on, right? Because oftentimes adoptees, and certainly people who suffer from addictions, are dealing with things that they can't quantify, that they can't put a language to, or they can't really explain to somebody else. So knowing what's going on is really helpful in developing a treatment or a care plan or an approach to dealing with it. So it's kind of double-sided, if you will.
What would be some of the markers for genetic disposition to addiction?
Great question, and a very important question given the explosion we've seen in DNA and other studies. Now, we have known in a way for decades that there's a genetic component of addiction and its predisposition. And scientists for decades had been working hard to isolate the genes responsible for this. And they always looked at specific chemicals, which changed until recently. The National Institutes of Health just released a study that talked about the mechanism of addiction, what happens when one becomes addicted, rather than what a chemical might be doing to somebody. And it's a very long name to this study, and if anyone's interested in, I'd be happy to share it. But here's what it basically says. It says that substance use disorders are heritable, or that they're able to be inherited, and they're influenced by complex interactions among multiple genes as well as environmental factors. So the study that I'm talking about discovered molecular patterns that underlie addiction. And they found, and I don't want to get too technical here, but they found 19 SNPs, which are single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are basically regions of genetic variation in the brain that are significantly associated with general addiction risk, and 47 of these SNPs for specific substance use disorders. And this has never been done before. So this is a major step in addiction circles. I won't say that I'm surprised that it hasn't hit the major airways and we can't see it every day on social media and other media, but this is a big deal. So these genetic variations now focus on the regulation of dopamine that is signaled in the brain. And of course, many drugs of abuse like opioids or cocaine in particular, or nicotine, if anyone's had that legal addiction, although the study doesn't say it, it also plays out with gambling and internet usage and shopping and binge eating and others. These drugs cause dopamine to flood the brain, to flood a reward pathway, right? We set reward, our brain is getting flooded sometimes 10 times more than a natural reward, which might be having a relationship or succeeding at something at work or something like that. And the brain remembers the surge that it gets from that dopamine and it associates it with an addictive behavior or an addictive substance. And then we're in trouble. Then the desire or the seeking these feelings causes craving, and it becomes addictive over time. And regarding adoptees specifically, we know this to be true. There's been research, genetic research dating back to 1973 that focused on this heredity, this genetic component of addiction. And it's found from the very beginning that adoptees who have a birth parent with a substance use disorder have higher levels of alcoholism and drug addiction. And there have been other studies that confirm that over the years. So a big genetic component, one that we're understanding better today as a mechanism going forward, which is huge because, and I don't want to go off on a rant here, but it seems like the neuroscientists today are finding ways to manipulate us and alter our behavior in unhealthy ways rather than finding healthy ways to help us out.
Definitely so. That was really helpful. And we know that sometimes the expression, the manifestation doesn't happen unless there's maybe an environmental, I don't know what the best word is, stimulus or occasion for it. Could you talk a little bit about what brings the addiction out or what causes it to manifest?
Well, these environmental cues, as I would describe them, well said. They can be triggered, they can be characterized as other things, but there are certain environments that I guess are formative in the formulation of addiction. Just like, if you can imagine, and I relate this to trauma in particular, it wasn't all that long ago where we didn't understand PTSD all that well. But today, you'd be hard pressed to find someone who doesn't understand if we send a young woman or a young man to a foreign land, engaged in a horrific war, and they see atrocities, that when they come home, they might be affected by this for a lifetime, right? That's an environmental cue. That's an environmental trigger to their trauma. Now, the trick is that not all people who experience that will experience trauma. They experience a traumatic event or a possible trauma-causing event, but not all of them will develop PTSD. And that's similar in environment. Some people can become beholden to these environmental cues, but others might not. So going back to what we were talking about a minute ago, since the studies in 1993, a lot of environmental studies have been done looking at that environmental component of addiction. And what those studies have found is that when adoptive parents use substances or abuse substances, or they have mental health issues, that can be predictive, leading to adult adoptees and abuse and addiction and mental health issues. And that's simply been my case, right? I had a predisposition to alcoholism as a result of my genetic mother having fought, and I had it as a result of being in a home, in an adoptive home, where a parent was struggling with alcoholism and another was struggling with lifelong anxiety and depression. So what research basically shows also is that foster care and those types of environments can predispose one to risk factors for substance use disorders. And finally, the research in terms of environment also shows that international adoption and transracial adoption can predispose people to substance abuse disorders, and for adults later to meet substance abuse criteria even years after they've had that experience. So this environmental component is about predisposition. Of course, it's not about cause and effect, right? So in my case, I've asked myself, did the distress of being relinquished and as a newborn cause my addiction to alcohol? And I can't say yes, it absolutely did. It predisposed me to have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, certainly, and we can understand why. I also asked if the struggles I had attaching with my adoptive family caused my addiction. Well, no, they predisposed me to addiction. So those are environmental components that have affected me. Many other people who have had similar experiences to me, affected by them, but we're at greater environmental risk, and we're affected by trauma due to other things also. Parental neglect can happen, especially in homes with substance use disorder. There is prenatal substance exposure, which happens quite frequently, sadly, in our community. We can be affected by the environment of chaos or chaotic environments, or if we're involved with out-of-home placement or child welfare professionals. These are all interruptions or disruptions to our environment, right? And that's important to use that word. Some people may call those traumas. I refer to them as developmental interruptions or adversities, and these can predispose adoptees to addiction, both to chemicals and other behaviors. So other unhealthy coping mechanisms as well. So yes, there are genetic and environmental components to addiction that we have to be particularly aware of.
So a person may at some point start to suspect or see that maybe there's a situation in their own life where something might need to be done. What's usually the point at which somebody might come into that sort of awareness that maybe they're struggling with addiction and just having to come to terms with that?
I think that's a great question, and this is ultimately the question to be solved, right? We have a show called Intervention that's been on the air for decades. It repeatedly shows people who are unaware of the problems that they're having, or others from the outside have to come in and try to convince them that they're having problems before they seek help. And I think that's ultimately the short answer thrust to a very complex and complicated question. So the answer is when behaviors start causing repeated negative consequences in life, that situation should be addressed for any number of reasons. And it's simply about attempting to raise one's awareness and investigating how the power of addiction might be playing out in one's life and in their environment and their relationships. And then, of course, once that awareness comes, we need to acknowledge it. And we have to accept that, hey, we've got a problem that we are responsible for taking care of. And being pragmatic and realistic is about it. Recognizing that we're human is a place to start and a place to remain. By the time these negative consequences start surfacing, the brain is, as I mentioned before, is wired itself in a way that aggressively seeks a payoff for those substances. And whether that payoff is an increase in good feelings or euphoria, or whether that payoff is a decrease in pain or bad feelings, that's what the brain is doing and taking over. And what prevents most people from making changes themselves is not understanding the time and effort that it takes to change course, right? Or to rewire the brain, as well as to how difficult it sometimes is in maintaining motivation. And I talked about this because I think this discussion about motivation has been lost, right? And we live in a world where we know what the problem is. People have told you what the solution is, but there's sometimes interim steps missing in that process. So people feel powerless and helpless to do what others might have done. And I want to remind people that this process of change is not always linear, and it involves specific steps like pre-contemplation, like acknowledging that you're in a position where you have no intention or awareness to change, right? You don't see the behavior as negative. That's where you start. And then you start thinking about it. You contemplate whether there's a problem or that you have to seriously start thinking about it. And then you prepare to make change, right? You don't just jump into something. You start to think, what is this going to look like? How do I need to take action? Do I need support? What do I need to do? And then we finally take action. And this requires the most time and energy, but that's when we actually do things to change those negative behaviors. And once all that is said and done, we have to maintain it, right? We have to work with people to consolidate these gains and to prevent a relapse to unhealthy behaviors. And a really simple example of this is what happens in the health club industry at the first of the year, right? They advertise beginning of the year deals. People think, oh, I'm going to make some New Year's resolutions. I'm going to turn over a new leaf. I'm going to change my behavior starting on January 1st, and I'm going to go work out first, and I'm going to work out every day, and I'm going to get healthy. Well, the health clubs know that most people don't last for 14 days. So 2/3 of those people who made those promises have abandoned them after 14 days. After 3 weeks, 85% have abandoned those goals because they didn't go through this process of thinking about it, preparing for it, becoming more determined, and setting out specific actions to do that. So the answer is what can you do for yourself? Well, find ways to build motivation to change. And they're not always negative ways. Sure, you can make a list of all the negative things going on, but there are positive things that come to. What are you missing in your life? What are you missing in your relationships? What are you missing about the way you feel about yourself and your self-esteem, right? And then figure out how or where you can take specific actions to facilitate those changes. And that you're not defective if you need some help doing this. We all do at some point in time.
So the there's a heavy volitional component to the change decision wise, something that, but yet it's not all just your will getting it done, right? So you have supports and think resources. Could you talk a little bit about those things?
Yeah, absolutely. We live in a day and age where I mentioned at the beginning of our call that there are more resources and more people empathetic to what is going on than there ever has been before. So having said that, boy, where do I go? This is a big question. So I think.
Well, let's do this. Let's
Yeah.
talk about recovery as a subject, and then maybe towards the end here, once we cover something, maybe we can open it up to the larger conversation here without you having to feel like you're inundated by that. So I threw you a little bit of a curveball there.
Whatever you'd like to do is fine. Sure.
Okay, sure. So I am very interested in, obviously, anybody who's struggling with this to know about recovery and different things that recovery looks like. Could you talk a little bit about that?
You bet. You bet. Well, recovery can take any number of forms, and ultimately recovery is something that you need to define for yourself, right? It's something an individual has to say, this is what it is, right? We have lots of studies and lots of individuals who have ideas about what recovery looks like, but we need to feel what it is for ourselves. And oftentimes it's as simple as an improvement in functioning, an improvement in thinking, an improvement of feeling, an ability to deal better with emotions, right? And the great news is today is we have lots of places to go for it. We have lots of places within our community to go for it that didn't even exist a few years ago. But going and finding that help isn't easy, and getting healthy isn't easy. It's not just a one and done thing for adoptees. It's not just about stopping the behavior or getting sober or getting clean, right? Because the pre-addiction problems, that adversity that we experience, and the developmental interruptions and the trauma that often led to that addiction or the unhealthy behavior still exist after the self-medication process has been eliminated. And it's as though we have what would be called co-occurring disorders, right? Two or more things happening at the same time. Many of you may be familiar with Paul Sunderland's work. He's a London therapist. He's talked about adoption and addiction. There's a great YouTube video that he does, but he suggests that we think about relinquishees and adoptees who struggle with addiction as having co-occurring addiction and developmental trauma or developmental PTSD, and then address them concurrently, right? Concurrently. Treat these things at the same time by the same team if you're using a team of people. Now, that's great in theory, and it works, and there's research that shows it works in the addiction population. But the problem with this is that so many of us don't have any idea that our separation and adoption experiences might be influencing our addictions. We don't know. Some people say we haven't come out of the fog. There are other ways that one might approach that. And of course, mental health providers and medical providers lack understanding about that intersection between addiction and adoption. So if we seek help, or if we're trying to change, we focus exclusively on stopping that substance use and behavior. And then if we're successful, we only become disillusioned later when it doesn't solve all the many problems that we seem to be having, because obviously we didn't treat the separation at the time. So recovery, in continuing to answer that question, means that sometimes we have to do more work. We have to consistently take some more action to continue to heal. And that's because, you know what? Whoever they is, they lied to us. When they said time heals all wounds, we know better. And this is no more true than in the population of adoptees struggling with addiction, right? Time does not heal all wounds. What heals all wounds is healing. An intentional process of healing is what heals wounds. And what that intentional healing looks like is called recovery for the adoptee, if that's how they choose to define it. It involves becoming and remaining healthy by merging realism, right? What I feel to be real and true and honest and genuine and authentic, merging that realism with reality, what really is true, and what's honest and what's genuine and authentic. And of course, that's not easy to do. Some of us spend our entire lives trying to do that. Right? I indicate this in my memoir, Parallel Universes. That's part of the process of reconciling this realism from reality. But we need to sometimes do an ongoing process of learning and inner work. Sometimes consult with trusted confidants who can offer us better perspectives. Or in other words, right, here's what recovery looks like for me and many others, right? We need to find a way to create safety for ourselves. And by the way, there are lots of parallels to just the adoptee community in this. We have to create safety. We have to find validation in our experiences. We have to raise our awareness of what's possible and what the challenges are. We have to sometimes reframe these experiences that we had. Certainly, as I look back on my life, I made some assumptions that weren't true, but they were a result of having that trauma lens on everything else. And then we have to enhance our peace of mind and find that self-satisfaction that comes with knowing that we've done our best and we've made the effort, and we're as good as we can possibly be given the experiences that we've had. And of course, some might call that self-actualization. So for me, recovery, as I find it, is about self-actualization. And of course, it's a really difficult process for many of us who have had that fragmented or undeveloped sense of ego or sense of self throughout their life. So that's really abstract. That looks great. So what does it really look like? Well, it's about continuing to do the work, right? It's continuing to doing the emotional and psychological work and building resilience so that we can start to live a healthy philosophy no matter what happens, right? It's about relationality, finding connection, right? And it's about maintaining motivation, staying connected to people in communities that allow us to feel safe and validate those experiences, as well as to hold us accountable for our goals, which is tough to do sometimes. I call this process relentlessly pursuing reality, right? I have to constantly check between what I feel is right and what really is right, or what is real and what really is real. And that's my process of recovery. And of course, this is not just in every moment, or it's not putting out fires, right? It's about developing a philosophy that sustains us no matter what. We have to be okay no matter what. And we deserve to be okay no matter what. Sometimes we deserve to be great, but at the very least, we deserve to be okay. So recovery is not just about learning and having our healthy outlets to manage emotions. It's also about better understanding ourselves, right? Better and more completely answering that question, who am I? That is a lifelong seeking of origin process that many of us adoptees go through. So that's part of what recovery is. That's how I define my recovery. I investigate, I experiment with things, I take action, I work to get to better know myself, right? Including opening myself to select other trusted others, by the way, like all of you, and asking you to check me on my perceptions and maybe, if possible, affirm some of my experiences and my thoughts, right? But it's this lifelong process of identity development that really defines recovery for a lot of adoptees. It's about healing for those with separation and relinquishment experiences through identity development, and as a result, identity expansion, right? I gave a brief overview of my adoptee story in the beginning. That's a microcosm of who I am and where I've been. There's much more beyond that. And that ultimately is what healthy recovery is about, right? I'm not just a relinquishee, and we're not just adoptees or alcoholics or recovering people. We're so much richer and more complex than that. And it's in that intricacy that the wisdom and the strength and the healing and ultimately the recovery lie.
It's fantastic. I think you've kind of answered part of this here, which is places where you find hope, how you stay encouraged, and the role of the community maybe in achieving that.
Absolutely. Well, I think I have not been shy about sharing my belief and what has worked for me in the community and what I actually work with a lot of people on, right? It's about that relationality, right? Finding healthy connections where we feel safe, where we feel validated, and where we can do the work, right? Sadly, there's this notion in a lot of healing communities or a lot of trauma communities where all we have to do is find a safe place. And by the way, just because someone says it's safe doesn't mean it's safe for you. You have to determine that it's safe. So we find a safe place, and then we have our experiences validated, and all of a sudden the healing magically occurs. Well, that's not true. We need a safe place, and we need to be validated before we can do the work to begin that real healing. And it's really important that this community tells us what we need to hear instead of what they think we want to hear, right? They have to hold us accountable to healthy goals. And that's not only true of addiction, but it's true of the addiction, relinquishee and adoptee community in general. There was a book a few years ago, maybe some of you saw it, written by the author Johann Hari. It was called Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. He also wrote a book that was called Lost Connections, Why You're Depressed and How to Find Hope. And he did this TED Talk that was titled, Everything You Think You Know About Addiction is Wrong. And what Johann Hari basically said is, and I quote, the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. The opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection, end quote. So in other words, and we alluded to this in the research that the NIH just recently came out about the genetics, addiction is not a substance problem. It manifests itself through substances, but it also manifests itself through other behaviors. It's not about the substance. What it is it's a social disorder. It's about having a lack of healthy socialization that helps us to get through these things. And of course, we get that in this community. This makes a lot of sense. To those of us who struggle to find connection as a result of our relinquishment and adoption, it makes sense that this is a social disorder. So find a community. Yes, I can't say that often enough. I hope I don't sound like I'm in a soapbox, but find a support group or more than one support group. And again, in the last 5 years, with the proliferation of Zoom and virtual type meetings, as well as an increase in awareness in our community and peer-led activities in our community, these groups are much easier to find. And they're safe places, I hope, where people can get comfortable sharing their pain and concerns and talk to people about what they're going through, with people who are free of the stigma and judgment that some of us feel in our lives, feel on social media, or otherwise feel. So ultimately, your question was about the community. Well, community offers stabilization. It helps us with mutual support and coping skills. It keeps us away from negative influences. If we're hanging out in a healthy community, we're not doing those negative things. It offers us motivation, something I talked about earlier with the stages that we go through, because we're hanging with people who have similar goals to ours and have similar motivation to change their lifestyle. And it provides this normalization, right? This validation, letting us know that you are not alone. We are not alone, right? And it sounds like, as you probably know, for those of you who have been in Fireside and other groups, it's very much like this very meeting you're talking about here. But I have to utter a word of caution, and this is in the form of informed consent, right? I don't want to just talk about all the great things going on. There are some risks in connecting, right? We might go into some spaces that aren't as safe and healthy as we thought they were, right? But there's also this contradiction or this irony that's at play, right? If we say that the ultimate solution to healing is connecting, that can cause a problem with us, because connecting is what many adoptees and separated people and people with developmental interruptions and trauma have immense difficulty with, right? It takes this immense leap of trust to learn how to trust. And prescribing someone to go to a group and say it's all going to be great can be really tough for individuals. So I would do a lot of work in this area. I did this work personally, but I work with people who struggle on this. And what we do in that case is we trust the process. And I know that sounds like a cliche, but it's not, right? We help people to understand how much stronger they've gotten simply by opening themselves to the possibility of new connections that they were defended against and protecting themselves up in the past. And if anyone's more interested in this, by the way, I wrote a white paper titled Social Unity, Restore the Powers of Community Support Systems, that addresses and works through these challenges. It was initially derived from the keynote I did at the 2021 National Association of Adoptees and Parents Conference, and I offer it at my webpage, davidbohl.com. It's a free download, and it talks about specific issues and how to overcome them for those of us who struggle with these issues.
Oh, that's amazing. And it really hit when you said the huge act of trust it takes to learn how to trust. Yeah, I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. That is kind of what we do here as Fireside Adoptees, is opportunities for people to trust, but never pushing them into it, never going faster than they're ready, never asking them to go above where they're comfortable with. And it seems to be reciprocated back that people start to trust. And it's well really noticeable.
Well said. And to go back to that question about what is recovery, right? It's about empowerment. That's exactly what you and the Fireside groups are doing. You're empowering people to have these realizations and to take control of things that they can control. And that's where that autonomy and that power come in, making healthy choices going forward.
Thank you. So if you had a word for people whose loved ones are struggling with addiction, and maybe those people who are in the addiction aren't ready yet to do something for loved ones who are facing that, do you have any particular words for somebody who might be in that situation?
Well, yes, and these words, I hope don't ring empty, yet they ring true across that whole constellation of individuals who are either exposed to addiction, grew up with it, are experiencing it themselves, have a family member or colleague who's doing it, right? The ultimate message I have for them is simply, you do not have to suffer anymore, right? Needlessly or repeatedly, you don't have to suffer, right? There are different ways of dealing with these things, right? And it's really easy to do. Let me rephrase that. It's straightforward to do, and there are people who can model it and teach it to you if you're interested, right? And it's about staying connected to reality as best you can, and you can do that. That's the message to families, right? You can acknowledge these challenges, right? And then that's part of the advice that I have that you suggested. Talk about these things. Talk about these things in healthy ways, right? Do not allow them to be the elephant in the living room. Many people in the adoptee community talk about how things were not discussed or were forbidden from being discussed as they were growing up, and the pain that this caused, right? That for them, and the confusion that it caused, and how it caused people to take wrongful or unhealthy interpretations of what was going on, or might have to confabulate information or behaviors or look for synthetic or artificial means of doing that in their families, right? So that's what I would say ultimately. And I borrow from other people, the Stoic philosophers, and not everybody likes the Stoic philosophers, but it's part of what my daily philosophy is about. They say the obstacle is the way, right? So acknowledge it, right? Move forward, address the problem, connect with these people and resources that we're talking about, both in the recovery and the relinquishment communities. Find these solution-based strategies and the modeling of individuals that the individuals do of the very behavior that you're searching for in yourself. And take care of yourself, right? To take care of yourself as best you can, whether you're in the throes of addiction, whether you're a family member trying to deal with it and care for it, or whether you have it in your family genetics, right? Take care of yourself. We need you around in this community and on this planet, right? And to do that, this is going to sound really hollow, but again, this is so very important. I mean, it's about starting with what you can control, and what you can control is taking care of yourself, right? Keeping your body and mind as healthy as possible, right? Have some regular diet and exercise and sleep, get proper medical care, engage in some learning every day or a flow activity that helps you to feel connected to something, right? Connect also with yourself and others and something higher or bigger than yourself if that's something that works in your life, and learn what boundaries are, right? Taking care of yourself is about boundaries. These simple limits and rules we set for ourselves within relationships is a way that we stay safe. And there's no coincidence that I'm talking about safety again. This is so important for us because we have to be okay no matter what happens. So these boundaries that we want to practice as family members or individuals is number one, I'm not going to allow myself to be hurt or unsafe. And number two, I'm not going to enable unhealthy behaviors. I'm not going to do anything to be unsafe. I'm not going to enable unhealthy behaviors. It's as simple as that. People struggle with boundaries, right? Because relationships can be so difficult, especially when there's stress or chronic stress or trauma or developmental interruptions in them, right? But remember, boundaries are not a way to manipulate or punish yourself or anybody else, right? Boundaries are simply a way to live by your value, to live by who you are, and to separate yourself from those unhealthy enmeshments and those toxic environments, right? And again, the message, Greg, continues, right? Be gentle with yourself. I mean, I know this is easier said than done, but there are others who are practicing this, so find them. I see a lot of them are here with us tonight, and you can do this, right? I've done this. Others have done this. You can do this. So I can keep talking about this forever. The last thing is keep it simple, right? Keep it simple. I see you, adoptees, family members, colleagues. I see you. I hear you. I feel you. Healing is possible. There are alternatives to that suffering. Healing's within your reach, and you're not alone. Let's heal together. Reach out at any time.
What a great conversation. I know right emblazoned here at the bottom of your Zoom screen is davidbbohl.com. Is that the best place to get in touch with you?
That's an easy place to get in touch with me, absolutely. Or Google me. You might find me out there if you do that. Use the middle initial B. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm going to have to remember the B in there. David, such an important and valuable conversation and contribution to this repository of wisdom and help for people. Just really want to thank you again for being so open and vulnerable about your own story and about ways people can have hope through this and why this is such an issue in our community. So again, thank you so much for making time for us tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you for your support and allowing me to help raise awareness and offer support to our community.
And thanks to everybody who was in attendance here and who will watch this on the Fireside Adoptees YouTube channel. We appreciate all your support, and we enjoy the opportunity to bring events to you like this. So be well, and we will meet again soon. Thanks so much.